Now as we continue into the back half of our look at William Hurt's run through the 80s, we come to Children of a Lesser God from 1986. And I just talked about, when we talked about Kiss of the Spider Woman, that everything from Kiss of the Spider Woman forward, or really The Big Chill and everything forward, is a Best Picture nominee. And what's interesting about this especially is that this movie comes from the director Randa Haynes, who, if I remember correctly, or if I heard correctly, this was the first Best Picture nominee directed by a woman, which seems very late in the game for that to happen. Especially, it seems odd now that we've had so many, female directors get nominated and winning now. But, yeah, so going into this, it does seem like a rather conventional movie at first, where it's about, the really unconventional teacher, and it's how he uses his methods to see the potential in students that don't really see the potential in themselves, stuff like that, especially using music. It's the kind of stuff that you would see in what is, essentially a sort of obvious kind of movie, but of course the sort of turn in this story is that this is a deaf school, and he ultimately falls in love with not a student, but a former student, because I feel like the former would be a little odd for a plot, but despite the fact that Marla Matlin is playing somebody a little bit older than her, so she was pretty much close to the age of the students when she actually made the movie, despite the fact that she's playing a 25-year-old, but yeah, so as far as that being the center of not just the plot itself, but also the romance and where the conflict is going to come in there, because he leads as a teacher, comes in and essentially wants to teach these deaf students to start speaking, which can be kind of a, I guess, controversial thing in the deaf community. Like, I guess it was, because we see throughout the movie when it's really important to some of the characters that they don't speak and that they live the way that they always have, but if I remember correctly, there was I'd heard about a controversy that happened, because naturally Marley won her Oscar, so the next year she presented actor when Michael Douglas won for Wall Street, and she made it a point that when she announced Douglas's name, that she spoke it, and I guess that was really controversial in the community, because it kind of almost seemed to negate the purpose of what this movie was standing for and what a lot of them stand for, which is not being forced to speak, and they thought she was kind of encouraging that or something, which I don't believe is the case or anything like that, but that was just more of a misunderstanding of what her intentions were. But yeah, so that's kind of the center of this plot here, is him trying to convince her to do something that she may not want to do, all while this romance is going on. And what's interesting about that kind of being the major conflict between them is that in a typical romance movie, it's pretty much the romance itself that tends to be the conflict. So here we actually get a whole sort of lived-in relationship pretty quickly, where it's pretty much right after it's very early in the movie when they sort of consummate, I guess, this being a relationship in the pool scene, that he decides that, we should live together, and then that's what they do, and it's the love is pretty much instantaneous from there, and then it's what happens after that, when typically reaching this point would be the end of a romance movie. It's kind of just the beginning of this one, and so there's this interesting sort of dynamic between them, where it seems like we're going back and forth between them still being in the honeymoon phase and them seeming like an old married couple. Just somewhere in between and kind of back and forth. And it's there's even little details in there, when she's getting ready to go to the poker game and there's pictures of them together on the mirror. And it's that feels like something you would see in a relationship years in or something like that. But I guess everything just feels really lived in, and then we get scenes that's able to lead us to scenes, romantic scenes that happen that don't involve trying to push this towards the romance, but they just kind of already exist. These two, I guess you could say, contrasting scenes when she's kind of showing him how she thinks waves sound, which is this really beautiful scene, and then you counter that with him trying to explain to her what music sounds like, and it doesn't really work in the same way, and it's like you kind of get this idea that there will be times where she seems to understand sound even better than he does, just by experiencing it or not experiencing it the way that she does. And that's just sort of this important thread that you kind of see, not just through the romance, but also each character's intentions also, and how these things are contrasting and what it's doing to the relationship itself. I do think if there is one obstacle this movie might have to where it doesn't feel like it's letting us in as much as it could, it would be the lack of subtitles. Where it's like, and it's not necessarily just that there's a lack of subtitles, because honestly, I feel like Marley especially can say so much just by the way that she signs, and that's where a lot of her, like, the strength of performance really comes from, is seeing her emotion come through the signing, to where you can just kind of read her yourself without even knowing for sure what she's saying. But it's the choice to have everybody that talks to a deaf person in this movie repeat out loud what they're signing. And that's an interesting choice, and it does seem like it could seem sort of unnatural from a sort of dialogue perspective and an interaction perspective. But I do think there's something about the way Hurt does this and the way Hurt's character approaches this and his performance and just kind of Hurt's voice in general. Kind of seems to do this, like when he explains it away by basically saying, I like to hear myself talk. And it's like, we do kind of buy that, especially from a character like this, whose whole inner being is about, speech itself and getting to that point. But it does seem like it can put us as an audience at a bit of a distance from her. Like, it doesn't feel like we're as in her perspective as we probably could be or should be. We get that in stuff, in moments like when they go out dancing for the first time and she like starts dancing with her eyes closed to the point that she gets lost in it, and when she opens her eyes and she sees everybody dancing differently because the song has changed, it's almost like somebody waking up in a different world or something. And that gives us a taste of it. And then there is the pool scene that's really nice because they're both underwater, and of course once you're submerged underwater you can't hear anything, so it kind of puts them on this even playing field that we see, and given what's happening in this moment between them, it does seem like that this is the moment they should be the most in sync, and the fact that it's that added factor is really nicely done. But like I said, I still think there's a little bit of distance there, and I think that's where a lot of the strength of Madeline's performance comes from, is kind of having to go through this obstacle and kind of make sure that her performance itself seems to be giving us that insight and that perspective that we're not quite getting from the writing. Which I wouldn't want to disrespect the writing at all, especially Morgan Manoff, whose play that it comes from, and who co-wrote the script. But there are cases here where characters do... There are some characters that feel like we don't get as much as we could. Like, it feels kind of surface level a little bit with the Piper Laurie scenes. And much as I appreciate Piper Laurie's performance here, her Oscar nomination's always been kind of... I'm never quite sure where the Oscar nomination came from, unless it was just the movie's popularity kind of rode her to that point. But we do get nice moments regardless of that surface level feeling, like the fact that when Hertz meets her for the first time, and she seems like she'd be kind of uncaring, where like he asks her, did you ever learn to sign? And it seems like she's really avoiding the question, which kind of makes you think it's no, but then we learn later, obviously, when they interact, that she does, and that all of this kind of stems from her feelings about her father and Piper Laurie's feelings about Marley's father that kind of set off a lot of this trauma that she has. We hear about, the way she was, bullied about, and the bad experience she had when she tried to speak before. But it really seems like the really deep-seated trauma comes back to her parents, which is an interesting route to take, and not as obvious, and honestly probably the more realistic, for sure. But like I said, I do think we could have gone more into that, but these Piper Laurie scenes are really short. And so they don't kind of have as much staying power as they could. I think if we just delve just a little bit more into that, I'm not saying that they have to beat us over the head with it, but just to kind of delve in just a little bit deeper, where it's like where she's such a crucial character, but I think we get a lot more out of, like I said, like more interaction would have changed this, because I feel like even though not a lot of time is spent on the other individual students, that those are some of the strongest scenes in the movie. I almost think the scenes with him teaching the students is kind of the secret weapon of this movie, where it's like, even though we do have the romance and we do kind of have delving into her trauma and this back and forth about, whether she should speak or whether she shouldn't, the secret weapon, the movie wouldn't be as good, I think, without these scenes with the students also, and we kind of get to see him playing this teacher, and it's definitely one of those roles and one of those performances that he's able to pull off, where it's like, even though it's a different kind of method and it's, the students are going through completely different experiences than, people like hearing people, he's still playing that kind of character where if you've had any sort of teacher that you even somewhat connected with, or definitely connected with, you're going to kind of get vibes, and it's going to remind you of moments that you had with real teachers, and that's always this really nice feeling. I feel like that's something that you can kind of throw him into kind of the list of quintessential teacher performances for this movie, which is really great. But talking about some of these, there's also the writing's really coming through with the student scenes also, like the moment when he's when one of the students is saying, "Let's go somewhere and do it," talking about one of the girls in the class, and when her kind of says this back to him, kind of getting him to emphasize a little more the student response with, "Well, I'd rather with her," is a really funny and clever interaction. And I especially love his interactions with William, the guy that he's essentially teaching to insult him out loud. Where there's that really great scene on the basketball court where it's like this sort of there's like one cut at the beginning of it, but most of this basketball scene is just one shot where the camera's just jumping around from character to character, and he's basically teaching him to call him an asshole out loud. And it's like, it's this really brief scene, but sometimes the brief scenes do leave an impact, especially since this is a recurring sort of gag with this character where he just starts screaming obscenities at him, like the dick brain moment, and I think they've reached fuckface by the end of the movie. And all that stuff is great. And, of course, the scenes with Lydia, where he's, teaching her the whole boomerang thing. And each time that song is utilized in the movie is great, especially the big performance scene. But then we do finally get to this point towards the end, where they've gone their separate ways. And there is, like, this little chunk of the movie that just kind of has no dialogue. And it's mainly him kind of going through life. Like, he goes back to the pool. There's a moment where he's at, like, the bar and he covers his ears. And the way things seem to be done much more subtly here. And it's like, you do get the vibe that maybe with more moments like this, maybe that would have been enough to counter the whole no subtitles thing. Where it would have kind of helped us put ourselves a bit more in Sarah's perspective, especially. But, like, and when I say, like, they do stuff subtly, like, I remember the first time I saw this movie, and the whole thing with Johnny, pretty much going completely over my head, where he's teaching, we get all these scenes where he's teaching the class, and there's the one kid, Johnny, that he's really trying to get to speak, and we keep getting these recurring moments where, like, everybody in the class is participating, and then Johnny isn't, and then there's another scene, and the same thing plays out. And you kind of get this sense for a while, because you're used to cliches, that at one of these points, Johnny is finally going to speak, and it's going to be this big triumphant moment for Leeds and for everybody. This big celebratory moment. And the moment never comes, and it sort of seems like it drops off. The last time we approach this whole Johnny thing is that he's in the class, and, he's asking, like, what's your favorite book? And he looks at Johnny, and he doesn't even ask the question. He just looks at him, and they look at each other, almost like there's finally an understanding here. That understanding being that if they should not be forced to speak. And it's like that if they should be able to live in that world where they talk about the world of sound and the world of silence, and that being like two different planets essentially. But they should not be forced to go from one to the other. And so, like, when he kind of has that understanding with Johnny, completely through no dialogue, which is completely appropriate, is when it seems like he has the epiphany that leads us to the final scene between him and Sarah, where it's like, where he finally decides, maybe I won't try to cross you in this world, but maybe we can at least meet halfway. And it is this really big, sort of romantic ending. I really don't want to end on a downer. I really, really don't. Especially since this is especially to remember the greatness that William Hurt brought us, especially in the 80s. But I do think one thing that sort of taints this movie a little bit is if you know the relationship between William Hurt and Marlee Matlin in real life, where it's like, and it's you can look it up and do the research, but it was not a good relationship, and so looking at that, like, and when you know that going in, and when you see the way that their lives contrast, you kind of get the vibe through the whole movie that this was always meant to be a doomed relationship. Like, it's almost kind of surprising that they decide to meet halfway and the movie ends romantically. But it's like, I do wonder how much of a part it plays their real-life relationship, making it feel like the relationship between Leeds and Sarah just kind of feels inherently doomed in a sense, and kind of adds this sort of almost dark nature to what their relationship is, because their relationship in the movie obviously gets very intense as well, and it's, yeah, so like I said, I don't know if that's just the romantic ending just doesn't work in general, or if it's that real life feeling leaking in, but I do always feel like that it's like if we had gone further past, the credits rolling, this will be one of those movie relationships that didn't get very far. But the fact that, the idea of meeting halfway and the idea of accepting people and letting them be who they want to be and live how they want to live, especially when they're in this situation that they never asked to be in, it's a whole other thing. So I think that's pretty much how I can probably leave this. So yes, it is still a very powerful movie, but I do think it has maybe a couple of setbacks here and there. But there are portions of the movie that specifically sort of overcome those things, which is really great. So yeah, so after this we only have 2 left with Broadcast News and The Accidental Tourist. So kind of going back to 2 comedies to end this out, interestingly enough. We've certainly, that's another great thing about his run in the 80s. It's such a roller coaster of things that you go through and feelings that you go through and genres and all that. So we will continue to do this for these next 2 videos, as well as the remake verses and other normal verses, as we finish out September here in this last week and go into October, where all the horror is and all the really, really fun stuff is. So yeah, so I think that's it for this. So until the next thing, I think that's it.